Hi guys, welcome back to the Home and Homestead. I'm Rebecca. Today we'll be doing part 2 of a 2-part series of how to ferment homemade sauerkraut. So we did 4 different varieties of a green cabbage homemade sauerkraut. You can watch part 1 for the recipe and the fermentation process. And for today, for part 2, I'll go over how we can store our homemade sauerkraut once it is finished fermenting. So let's head to the kitchen and check out our homemade sauerkraut. So here we have the 4 varieties of the homemade sauerkraut that we did together in part 1. And what I did was I continued to check it until I felt that the sauerkraut looked, smelled, and tasted as I wanted it to. And I have 2 different styles. I have a clamp top lid and a mason jar with a wide mouth top. Now these previously had a silicone airlock top, which you can see in part 1, but once the homemade sauerkraut was finished fermenting, I immediately took that off and put an airtight lid on there and put all of this into the refrigerator so it would stop fermenting and it would stay nice until I was ready to do my storage methods. So what I did notice was I was planning to can the other day. Life happens and I didn't get to it, so 2 of the varieties were just one day too long, didn't quite have the right smell, and when you're doing home fermenting and food preservation, when in doubt, throw it out. So I ended up tossing 2 of the varieties in the mason jar style. I had the plain and the red pepper. They just smelled a little off, so I tossed them. So now I have all 4 varieties in the clamp top lid and the caraway and garlic in the mason jar. So there's 2 different ways that we can store our homemade sauerkraut. One is we can store it in the refrigerator, and it lasts for many months that way. So for these clamp top lid jars, I would simply take the top cabbage leaf and the glass weight out and put it in the refrigerator. And that way it's ready to go and eat whenever you wanted to. Another way, if you know you're not going to eat it for a while and you don't want it taking up space in your refrigerator, you can also water bath can your homemade sauerkraut. And that's what I'm going to do for this round of homemade sauerkraut. A lot of these varieties I really enjoy during the warmer months when we do a lot of barbecuing. We really enjoy the plain on bratwurst and hot dogs and things like that. The garlic is really delicious on hamburgers or even as a side. The caraway is wonderful on Reuben sandwiches and any sort of Reuben appetizer you might want to make. And then the red pepper is a really spicy and fun one that could be just a tasty side dish even. But it would certainly go with any of the recipes that I mentioned just now. So I'm going to end up canning these so they don't take up room in the refrigerator during the holiday season. So when you're water bath canning, you can do 2 different ways. You can do cold pack or you can do the hot pack method, which is what I'm going to do today. So let's head to the stovetop and get our homemade sauerkraut ready to do some hot pack water bath canning. So now we're going to prepare our sauerkraut to go on the stovetop. So first I'm going to start with my plain and kind of work my way up on the different varieties. So I will take the weight off the top and the leaf. Just make sure everything looks nice. It's a really wonderful amount of brine and the sauerkraut looks great. It has a nice crisp texture to it still, so this is ready to go. I'm simply going to put this into a little pot here. Now if I was doing a really large batch, I would get my Dutch oven out. Since I did all the different varieties this time, this smaller pot will do just fine. Let me loosen this up here. Now if you find that your homemade sauerkraut was kind of dry and it didn't have enough brine to it, you can certainly add your own brine to your mixture so there's enough juices. And the National Center for Home Food Preservation, their recipe for extra brine is 1.5 tablespoons of the canning salt per quart of water. You'd simply boil your water, add your salt, and pour that extra liquid over your homemade sauerkraut. That would work for all the different varieties today. All right, so you have a nice big full pot of homemade sauerkraut. I'll get this on the stove top. It needs to have a little more liquid added to it because we're going to bring this to a boil. Okay, so I have my kettle going for some boiling water. I have my canning salt out just in case I need to make some more brine, which I think we will for this, which is perfectly fine. So I have the cooktop on to a medium-high heat. And we're just going to bring this slowly up to a boil. So now I'm going to make some additional brine like I just spoke about. So I add 1.5 tablespoons of a canning salt into a glass vessel, and I'll add a quart of water that I boiled in my electric kettle. I'll give this a nice stir to get that salt to dissolve in there. And I'll pour our brine over the top. So we need this to boil. If it doesn't have liquid in it, it's not going to boil. There we go. Now we'll slowly bring this up to a boil. While that heats up, I'm going to fill this Dutch oven here with my next variety of our homemade sauerkraut. So here we are to our second variety, which is the garlic. So I'll open both of these jars here, remove the glass, weight, and the leaf if it's still in there. And we'll pour this right into our pot. This was a little bigger batch, so I will use my Dutch oven for this one. It smells really good. You get that tangy, tart, and sour smell of a sauerkraut, with that little bit of garlic aroma. So good. So I will mention that if you do the water bath canning and the hot pack method such that we're doing today, you will negate that probiotic effect of your homemade sauerkraut. If you were to just put it in the refrigerator, if your goal is to have a nice probiotic that you would get from a home ferment of sauerkraut, I would recommend doing the refrigeration. But as I said before, I'm trying not to take up a lot of room in my refrigerator during the holidays, and I'll probably use this later in the warmer months, and I don't want to waste the efforts that I put into making this homemade sauerkraut. This is still an incredibly healthy condiment or side dish, and I don't know if it gets much more natural than adding salt to a vegetable and letting nature do its thing. So now I'm going to make some more extra brine, and we can get this on the cooktop and get this boiling. Alright, so I've been coming through and just stirring. This is the plain sauerkraut. This is the garlic sauerkraut. I've been just stirring it every now and then as we bring this slowly up to a boil. We're just about there for the plain. Ended up adding 2 quarts of the additional brine for the garlic, and we'll bring this slowly up to a boil. Now let's get our third variety ready for the stovetop, which is our red pepper homemade sauerkraut. I'll remove that glass weight and the top cabbage leaf. Okay, we'll add this to the pot. This has a nice and crunchy texture to it as well, and it's actually kind of a festive looking sauerkraut with the little specks of the red pepper flakes. It's kind of fun. This is a little full for this pot, so once the plain sauerkraut is finished, I'll transfer it to there, but I just wanted to get it out of the jar and ready to go because the plain is just about ready to go into its canning jars. Perfect timing, our plain homemade sauerkraut is boiling. And it smells so good. Alright, let's turn that off and we'll get our hot homemade sauerkraut into our hot jars. So we're going to fill these canning jars to a 1/2 inch headspace, which is about halfway up the side threads. You can absolutely use your headspace measuring tool if you're not comfortable with eyeballing that. So I try to get the sauerkraut in first. We're going to kind of pack it into the jars a bit. Use a nice large spoon and press that sauerkraut in. You move a little bit of this brine. There we go. We have the sauerkraut nice and packed down. We have a nice amount of brine on top as well. We're to about a 1/2 inch headspace. I made sure the air bubbles are removed, so I'll just set this off to the side here. And we'll fill some more jars. Now our garlic sauerkraut is just about boiling as well, so we'll be able to jar that up once we finish our plain sauerkraut. I'll take that large spoon, press that down in there. Top off to get that head space that we want. Bubble removal tool in there. There we go. And I'll keep filling these jars. So here we have our 3 pints of the plain homemade sauerkraut. So I'm simply going to wipe the rim and the side threads with the wet paper towel that I just moistened with some water. Just removing any food residue or salt water that you may have spilt on the rim or side threads, just to keep things clean. And we'll put the lid on, followed by the ring, just finger tight. The ring is simply there to keep the lid in place while it's processing. So lid, followed by the ring, finger tight. Set these off to the side. I have my water bath canner heating up. You may hear that in the background. And I transfer the red pepper sauerkraut into the plain sauerkraut's pot. So let's keep getting our homemade sauerkraut ready for canning. So the garlic is just about ready. It's starting to very slowly simmer, but the red pepper flake variety, this actually has come to a boil. It's a bit of a smaller batch, so this one's ready to go actually before the garlic. So let me get the red pepper variety into its jars. I can get this and the plain into the water bath canner. So just as before, we're going to take our warm sauerkraut, put it into some warm canning jars. I have some wide mouth pint jars, that's what I'm using today. I try to get a couple scoops of just the sauerkraut in there first. Take a nice sized spoon and press that down. You want to pack it pretty firmly down into the jar so then you can get some more sauerkraut into there. Let's get another scoop or so in here. Press that down. Take our headspace measuring tool. On the other end is the air bubble removal tool. Slide it around the edge. In the middle, just to remove those little bubbles. We'll set this off to the side and keep filling our jars. You definitely want to wear a little hot pad. I like the silicone ones like I have here, because then if they get wet, you can just rinse them off very easily and keep using them for your additional projects. Just a little bit more there. Let's go in. right, so now let's go get the lids and rings onto this variety and we'll get them into the water bath canner. So here we have our red pepper variety of sauerkraut. So I'm just going to wipe the rim and the side threads with the wet paper towel again. Then we'll place the lid, followed by the ring, just finger tight. So when I'm doing different varieties while water bath or pressure canning at the same time in the canner, I like to label the lids before they go in the canner. This one's pretty obvious because you can see the red pepper flakes, but I will still label them prior to going into the canner. And once they are finished processing and they sit and seal, that's when I like to date it, because then I know that I double checked the seal and I did the final step of dating at that point in time. So now we can get our plain and our red pepper versions of sauerkraut into the water bath canner. So we're over at the water bath canner. I've had this heating and getting ready to go while our batches of sauerkraut varieties were boiling. We double check the temperature. Perfect. Now we're going to place our jars into here. We have two varieties going in together right now. We're doing the plain sauerkraut as well as the red pepper variety. And our jars are covered with water by at least an inch or two. And we did the hot pack method for the homemade sauerkraut. The National Center for Home Food Preservation also lists a cold pack method. You can follow their recommendations for that. So the National Center for Home Food Preservation has the hot pack method, 10-minute minimum processing time for pints or 15 minutes minimum processing time for quarts. And Ball has 15 minutes minimum processing time for pints and 20 minutes minimum processing time for quarts. So whichever organization or company you want to follow for the recommendations, you do that. Also bear in mind your elevation or altitude will play a role. So if you're at a higher altitude, you may need to increase that minimum processing time I mentioned by the minutes on the right based on your altitude on the left. So we'll let these jars process, and once they're finished, I'll remove them from the canner, place them on the cooling and sealing area, and by then, the garlic variety should be ready to go into the canner for processing as well. Now, as our first two varieties are processing, our garlic variety is ready to go. Give this a nice stir. We'll get this into the canning jars. All right, the processing time has finished for our first batch of our homemade sauerkraut. So I'll turn the burner off here and I'll let them sit in the canner for about 5 minutes, and then I'll transfer them to the cooling and sealing area. In the meantime, we'll finish getting our garlic batch already in its jars and get them in the canner as well. So here we have our garlic variety of sauerkraut. And again, we're going to use a wet paper towel. Wipe off the rim and the side threads. This will help ensure a nice tight seal. And it just helps to keep your ring clean, because you can use that for multiple canning projects. Now we'll get the lid, followed by the ring, finger tight. Now I'll label these as well. This is the garlic, so we'll get these into the canner. So we're back over at the canner. Just double check the temperature. Good. We'll add our sauerkraut. So on the bottom of my canner, I have a jar rack, so that way I can place the jars directly on there and they're not sitting directly on the bottom of the canner. Our jars are covered with about 1 inch or so of water, and I can place the lid back on. So again, the minimum processing time is 10 to 15 minutes depending on what organization or company you're following, and you should add necessary processing time based on your altitude. So now let's do the fourth and final variety of homemade sauerkraut. So last but not least, we have what is probably my favorite variety of the homemade sauerkraut, and that is the caraway. So we will open the lids, remove the glass weight, and the top cabbage leaf. We'll add this to our Dutch oven. The cabbage has to remain nice and firm, nice clear brine. Smells wonderful. There we go. So again, I will make some more of the brine mixture and add that to here. We'll place this on the stovetop and bring it to a boil. The processing time has finished for our garlic batch. So let me remove the lid. I'll turn off the canner burner and we'll let these sit in here for about 5 minutes. Then we'll transfer them over to the cooling and sealing area as well. So let's head over to the stovetop for the final variety of caraway seed homemade sauerkraut and get them into their canning jars as well. All right, our final variety of the caraway seed homemade sauerkraut is boiling here. This smells delicious. It smells like rye bread. You know, the caraway rye. So tasty. Okay, let's get this into jars. Let's try to get one nice big scoop of mainly the sauerkraut in here. We'll take our spoon. Pack that down. Another spoonful with some sauerkraut and brine. We're going to fill to a 1/2 inch head space, so halfway up the threads. If there's a little more, just simply take it out. Smash it down there. Pack that nicely down. We'll take our headspace measuring tool. The other end is the air removing tool. Just help remove any air bubbles that may have formed when filling. I like to pack it down just so everything stays below the surface of the brine. I'll keep filling these jars. So here we have our caraway seed variety of homemade sauerkraut. So again, we'll just wipe the rim and the side threads. There we go. We'll put the lid followed by the ring, finger tight. And I'll write the variety on top. And we'll get these into the water bath canner. We'll get the lid off here. Get our jars in. Now if you're doing multiple batches of water bath canning, you just want to double check the water level between batches and add a little more water if necessary. I added a little bit of water, so now there's plenty of water over the top of the canning jars. So let me get the lid back on here. And we'll get the processing time going for our final variety of homemade sauerkraut. Okay, our fourth and final variety of homemade sauerkraut has finished canning. So I'll turn the burner off here and remove the lid. Let them sit here for about 5 minutes in the canner. And I'll move them over with the remainder of the varieties. We'll take a look at all 4 varieties of the homemade sauerkraut that we water bath canned today. All right, here you have it. Here we have our 4 varieties of homemade sauerkraut that we did together. You can watch part 1 of this series to see the recipe and the fermentation process. And now today we did the water bath canning of our homemade sauerkraut. And as I mentioned earlier, you can also store your homemade sauerkraut right in the refrigerator, and the clamp top lids that I use for the fermentation process work really nicely for that. I wanted to keep my refrigerator open for the holidays coming up, and I know that these varieties I really enjoyed during the barbecue season, so I wanted to water bath can these and put these on our canning pantry shelf. So now we have 4 varieties. We have the plain sauerkraut, which is a really clean and simple sauerkraut, which is simply the cabbage and salt flavoring. We also did some garlic, which is a fun twist, and it's great on sandwiches and hamburgers or as a side. We also did a nice spicy version with the red pepper flakes. And finally, my favorite, the caraway seed. That's a classic sauerkraut flavor combination and is wonderful on Reubens or Reuben themed appetizers, as well as be wonderful just on the side for a dish. Well, if you'd like more inspiration on food preservation projects, you can check out my food preservation or in the kitchen playlist. I hope you enjoy some other recipes and gardening or home decor or organizational videos you can check out on my channel. Well, if you're new to the channel or haven't done so yet, I would really appreciate you subscribing. If you enjoy this or any other videos that you watch, please give them a thumbs up. Well, I hope you're having a wonderful day. See you next time. Take care.